She walked in unnoticed, just another woman in a sea of designer-clad elites. But the moment Emma Miller took her shot, everything changed. The sound of the bullet hitting the bullseye shattered the silence, leaving the room frozen. No one knew who she was or what she'd been through, but one perfect shot proved she was anything but ordinary. Want to see how Emma turned the tables? Hit subscribe, and let's dive into this unforgettable journey. Blake Radcliffe watched her from across the room, his gaze a mixture of amusement and arrogance. He was the king of this world, the reigning champion, and no one, least of all a woman like Emma, was going to challenge his throne. His custom. Remington gleamed under the soft lighting, its polished barrel reflecting the smug smile on his face. He'd just hit another perfect bullseye, and the crowd of wealthy patrons, dressed in designer shooting gear, erupted in applause. Emma's presence barely registered to anyone, at first. She wasn't wearing the same expensive gear, or sporting the usual confidence that came with being part of this exclusive club. No one expected much from her, and certainly, no one expected the storm she was about to bring. She was just another face in the crowd, until she wasn't. "Excuse me," Emma said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped forward, clutching a small, worn leather purse that seemed out of place in the club's lavish surroundings. Her eyes nervously searched the front desk, her simple blue cardigan and department store jeans making her stick out like a sore thumb in a sea of expensive suits and polished shoes. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect blonde hair and a practiced smile, barely glanced up from her screen. "Membership cards only," she said dismissively, barely acknowledging Emma's presence. "I have a day pass," Emma replied, her voice soft but steady. She reached into her purse, pulling out a crinkled envelope. The receptionist looked at the pass for a moment, then back at Emma, her eyes scanning the simplicity of her appearance. With a dismissive flick of her wrist, she handed the pass back. "That's not what I meant. You really don't belong here." Emma didn't flinch. She simply nodded, tucking the pass back into her bag and turning away. Her steps were measured as she made her way toward the basic range, her mind focused, not on the people around her, but on the quiet promise she'd made to Nathan, her late husband. Nathan had been more than a husband. He'd been her teacher, her protector, and the one who had taught her everything she knew about shooting. A Navy SEAL sniper, Nathan had trained her not just to protect herself, but to master the art of control, the kind of control that could keep you alive when everything else around you was falling apart. Blake's laughter echoed in the background, loud and sharp. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn on the way to Walmart." His friends, a group of men who lived for the thrill of mocking others, burst into laughter, their amusement at Emma's presence bordering on cruelty. Emma's face remained expressionless, her eyes fixed on the floor as she walked to the farthest corner of the range. But then she paused. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, their sneers, their judgment. The crowd around her had already decided who she was, nothing more than a woman who didn't belong. But what they didn't know, what no one could see, was the fire that had been burning inside her for years. The fire of a woman who had learned to live with loss, who had learned to be strong, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Blake's voice cut through the air again, louder this time. $10 says she can't hit the target," he jeered, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Come on, I'll make it 10,000. I bet she's never held a gun in her life." Emma's breath hitched, just for a moment, as she unpacked the cloth, wrapped around her Glock 19. It wasn't a custom weapon, far from it, but it was hers, and it had served her well both on the range and off. Blake sauntered over to her, his confidence oozing from every step. He had no idea who she was, no idea what she had been through, but in his mind, she was just another woman who didn't belong here, just another target for his mockery. "Excuse me, ma'am," Blake said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This isn't a knitting circle." Emma finally looked up, her hazel eyes locking with his blue ones. There was something in her gaze, a steadiness that took Blake by surprise. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It was something else, something stronger. "I'm just here to practice," she replied quietly, her voice calm and controlled. Blake's smile widened. "Practice, huh? This place is for serious shooters. You sure you're up for it? 10,000 says you can't hit the bullseye from 50 yards. Emma didn't respond right away. Instead, she gently twisted the simple gold ring on her left hand, a gesture so small that only the most observant would have noticed it. But to her, that ring held more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a promise, connection to Nathan that she would never let go of. "I don't have that kind of money," Emma said, her voice low but firm. Blake's laugh was sharp, almost cruel. "If by some miracle you make the shot, I pay. If you miss, you leave, and never come back." Emma's eyes never left the target as she slowly stood, steadying herself. The world seemed to quiet as she focused, her hands sure as she gripped the Glock. There was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about proving Blake wrong. It was about keeping a promise. Blake's eyes narrowed, watching her every move. "All right, let's see what you've got." The moment Emma took the shot, time seemed to stand still. The sound of the bullet ringing through the air was crisp and clear, breaking the tension in the room. And as the target slowly moved back toward them, the crowd held its breath. When the target finally came to a stop, there it was, a perfect hole, dead center in the bullseye. The silence that followed was profound, leaving Blake and his entourage speechless. The crowd that had once mocked her now stared in stunned disbelief. Emma calmly placed the Glock back on the counter, her face unreadable. She didn't need to say anything. Her shot had said it all. Blake snatched the target from the retrieval system, examining it closely. His expression faltered, the smugness starting to slip away. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. But as Emma stood there, unshaken, she knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge had only just begun. As Emma's shot hit the bullseye, the stunned silence that followed was interrupted only by the soft hum of the target retrieval system. Blake Radcliffe, the club's reigning champion, stood frozen, his jaw tight, his confidence crumbling like a house of cards. He was a man who had built his entire identity around being the best, and the woman standing before him had just shattered that illusion with one simple shot. But amidst the shock and disbelief, there was one other person who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, Rebecca Johnson, the club's manager. A former competitive shooter herself, Rebecca had spent years in the elite shooting world, where skill and status were the currency. She'd seen it all, the arrogance, the pressure, the egos. But what she saw in Emma Miller was different. There was no pretense, no showmanship, just quiet focus and unshakable control. Rebecca's gaze remained fixed on Emma as she calmly placed her Glock back on the counter, her expression unreadable. She could sense the weight of the moment, the tension that had settled in the air, and for a brief moment she felt something unexpected: respect. Blake, however, was having none of it. He scoffed, muttering something about beginner's luck, and stormed off, his entourage following like obedient shadows. Rebecca's lips tightened. She knew what kind of man Blake was: cocky, entitled, and convinced that no one could ever challenge his place at the top. But what struck her most about Emma was how she handled the situation. There was no arrogance, no desire for recognition, just a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from her every move. She had watched Emma carefully as she took the shot. There was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that suggested she wasn't new to this. It wasn't just the skill, it was the presence, the kind of presence that came from something deeper than just practice. Rebecca's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle that Emma was unknowingly giving her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew there was more to Emma than met the eye. "Mr. Radcliffe," Rebecca said, stepping forward, her voice calm but firm, trying to keep the peace. "Maybe we should let our guest practice. In peace, it's not about the money." Blake waved her off, not even bothering to look at her. "Stay out of this, Rebecca. It's just a friendly wager," he said dismissively, not fully grasping the weight of his words. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. She had been in this world long enough to know the kind of power Blake wielded, not just with his skill, but with his money and influence. He could make or break careers with the flick of a wrist, but what he didn't realize was that the real power wasn't in the wealth or the status. It was in the person who could rise above it all. Like Emma, Rebecca had seen women like Emma before, the ones who didn't demand attention but commanded respect. She had been there herself, in her younger years, trying to make a name for herself in a world dominated by men with egos bigger than their skill. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fair, but Emma's quiet demeanor, her controlled breathing, the way she held herself, it all spoke of something deeper. Something Rebecca knew all too well. Emma wasn't just here to compete. She was here to reclaim something that had been lost. She could feel the rising tension in her chest. She had seen what Blake could do to people like Emma, how he could twist the truth, use his connections to destroy reputations, and silence those who dared challenge him. But something told her that Emma wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. As the crowd slowly gathered around Emma, their murmurs turning into hushed whispers, Rebecca's thoughts turned inward. She had been here before, in a world where people were either powerful or powerless, and there was rarely any in between. But Emma, she realized, wasn't just any player in this game. She wasn't here for glory or fame. She was here for something more personal, something more meaningful, something Rebecca couldn't yet fully understand. Emma had kept her emotions in check, her face a mask of calm composure. But Rebecca knew better than anyone that beneath that calm exterior, there was a storm brewing, a storm born from grief, from loss, from promises made and never broken. Emma's eyes had flickered for just a moment when she glanced down at her left hand at the simple gold band that encircled her finger, and Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any ring. It was the ring of someone who had been through hell and back, a widow's ring. Rebecca's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. She hadn't connected the dots before, but now it was clear. Emma wasn't just an ordinary woman. She wasn't some random shooter who had stumbled into the club on a whim. She was the widow of a Navy SEAL, a sniper with skills beyond anyone's comprehension. Emma had learned from the best, and now, in this moment, she was proving it to a room full of people who had no idea what they were about to witness. Rebecca felt a strange sense of responsibility wash over her. She couldn't just stand by and let Blake bully Emma. She couldn't let him manipulate the situation the way he always did. Blake Radcliffe might have the money and the prestige, but Emma had something far more valuable, something no one could buy: integrity. And Rebecca wasn't about to let Blake destroy that. She watched as Emma picked up her Glock again, her movements smooth, almost rehearsed. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just quiet determination. Rebecca knew the stakes were higher now. Emma had shown them a glimpse of her skill, but the real test was still ahead. Would she rise to the challenge, or would the pressure of this world of privilege and power, be too much to bear? The tension in the room was palpable. The air was thick with anticipation. Emma's next move could either cement her place in this world, or force her back into the shadows where people like Blake believed she belonged. But Emma, Rebecca realized, wasn't here for validation. She wasn't here to win. She was here to remind everyone in that room, especially Blake Radcliffe, that sometimes the quietest people have the loudest impact, and Emma Miller wasn't about to let anyone silence her. As Emma prepared for the next round, the tension in the room seemed to thicken, the weight of every pair of eyes on her like a physical force. Blake Radcliffe had already made his move. His challenge was set, the stakes were raised. But Emma wasn't here to prove a point to Blake, or anyone else for that matter. She was here for a promise she made to the man who had once taught her how to hold a weapon and control her fear. Blake's voice echoed through the range as he threw out his next challenge. $50,000, he declared, his eyes glinting, with a mix of amusement and barely concealed disdain. If you can hit 3 bullseyes in a row at 75 yards with this Glock, the money is yours. Miss even one, and you leave. Never to return, the crowd murmured, the challenge now seeming like a spectacle more than a simple wager. Blake was playing his hand, fully confident that Emma's quiet exterior masked nothing more than an amateur, with a lucky shot. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Emma's gaze never left the target. She could feel the eyes of the crowd, the weight of Blake's gaze on her back. But none of that mattered. In that moment, there was only the target, the Glock in her hands, and the promise she made to Nathan. The world around her faded. She had made her choice. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the memory of a man who had given everything for his country. A man who had taught her more than just how to shoot. Nathan had taught her how to survive, how to endure, and above all, how to control herself when everything around her was chaos. Blake didn't notice the slight shift in Emma's posture as she stood taller, more focused. The casual stance she'd had when she first walked into the club was gone, replaced by the confident, practiced movements of someone who had spent years under the tutelage of a professional sniper. Nathan had always said that shooting wasn't just about accuracy, it was about discipline, control, and Emma had mastered both. Rebecca Johnson, the club manager, had been watching Emma from the moment she'd walked into the range. At first, she'd written her off as just another outsider, someone who didn't belong in this world of elite shooters. But the more she watched, the more something about Emma's quiet demeanor intrigued her. There was a calmness in her movements, an inner strength that Rebecca couldn't ignore. Emma wasn't here for attention or glory. She was here for something deeper. Rebecca had seen the way Blake treated people like Emma. He had a way of making others feel small, insignificant. He was used to being the best, and he wouldn't tolerate anyone challenging that. But watching Emma stand her ground, refusing to back down, Rebecca felt something stir inside her. She'd seen men like Blake before, men who used their status to belittle others, to manipulate situations to their advantage, but she had a feeling Emma wasn't going to let Blake's money or influence get the best of her. Emma's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the Glock. Her heart raced, but she didn't let it show. Every muscle in her body was tuned in, every breath measured. The first shot was slow, deliberate. She exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and heard the sharp crack of the gunshot. The sound echoed in the range, a stark contrast to the silence that followed. The target moved toward them, and Blake's eyes never left it. As it stopped, Emma's breath caught in her throat. She'd done it. Dead center, first try. The room was still, the silence deafening. Blake's face, usually so confident, had started to tighten, his smug expression faltering. The crowd murmured, some in disbelief, others in admiration. But Blake wasn't done. He could feel his pride slipping, and he wasn't going to let it go that easily. You got lucky, Blake muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched. Let's see if you can do it again. The second shot was even quicker. Emma adjusted, her stance, her hands steady as she lined up the target. The crowd was watching her now, some leaning in closer, others pulling out their phones. This was no longer just a game. This was a public spectacle. Blake, still reeling from the first shot, seemed to lose his composure. He moved to the side, speaking to a few of his companions, but his eyes were still fixed on Emma. Rebecca, noticing the tension building, stepped in. Mr. Radcliffe, perhaps we should let our guest practice without further interruptions, she suggested. Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying note of warning. She could sense Blake's unease, but she also knew the crowd was starting to turn their attention to Emma. They were starting to see something that Blake couldn't control. Blake waved her off, his gaze hardening. Stay out of this, Rebecca, he snapped. She's not going to win this, I'll make sure of it. Emma's eyes flicked briefly to Rebecca before focusing back on the target. The second shot rang out. Bullseye. Perfect. 2 in a row. The crowd was beginning to murmur in earnest now. There was no denying it. Emma had skill. But Blake was still determined to prove her wrong. He had to. The thought of losing to her, to a woman who didn't belong in his world, was unbearable. The pressure was building, and Blake was feeling, but he refused to show weakness. Emma didn't notice. She was focused only on her breathing, her stance, the target. It wasn't about Blake. It wasn't about the crowd. It was about keeping her promise to Nathan. The third shot was approaching. This would decide everything. But then, just as Emma was preparing to take her final shot, something caught her eye. A flash of light. It was brief, just a glint of something in her peripheral vision. She didn't flinch, didn't break her concentration, but it was enough to throw her off for a split second. A flicker of doubt. She closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to reset. The world around her felt like it was closing in. The pressure, the eyes on her, the weight of the challenge. But she couldn't afford to let it consume her. She twisted her wedding ring, a small movement that no one but her would notice. It was a tiny gesture, a silent conversation with the man who had taught her everything she knew. The final shot was coming. She took a deep breath, adjusted her stance, and focused. She could feel Nathan's presence with her in that moment. It was his voice, calm and steady in her ear. Control, Emma. Breathe, and let your body do the work. The winner shot rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. The sound of the gunshot echoed, followed by a silence that felt unbearable. Blake was watching her, his eyes narrowed. He knew the third shot was the one that would make or break everything. When the target finally returned, Blake's breath. There it was, dead center once again. The crowd erupted. The applause was deafening. Emma stood motionless, her face still, her heart racing. She had done it. But Blake wasn't ready to admit defeat. He snatched the target from the retrieval system and examined it closely, his fingers trembling slightly. Beginner's luck, he muttered through gritted teeth. But the doubt was already creeping in. Rebecca stepped forward, her eyes steady. That was no luck, Mr. Radcliffe. That was skill. And you know it. Blake's expression faltered, his control slipping. He couldn't deny it. But the truth was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Emma Miller was no amateur. She was a woman who had faced grief, hardship, and loss, and emerged stronger for it. She had taken on the elite shooters and, against all odds, come out on top. And Blake Radcliffe? He was about to find out what it truly meant to lose, not just a competition, but his sense of invincibility. The final moments of the competition were surreal. The air in the elite shooters club was thick with anticipation, and the crowd's roars faded into a distant hum as Blake Radcliffe stood frozen, staring at the target Emma had just hit. He had wagered everything, his pride, his reputation, and his identity as the top shooter in the world. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Emma Miller, the quiet woman in the blue cardigan, had come into his world and upended it with nothing more than her calm, steady hands and unshakable focus. Blake's jaw clenched as he snatched the target from the retrieval system, his fingers trembling slightly. He couldn't believe it. There was no way she could have done it. She wasn't supposed to be able to hit all 3 bullseyes at 75 yards. Yet there they were, perfectly placed holes in the center of each target. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was skill, unmatched, undeniable skill. But Blake couldn't admit that, not yet. Not to himself, and certainly not to the crowd. The applause continued to ring in Emma's ears, but her gaze remained steady, her face calm. She hadn't come here to prove anything to anyone. She had come to honor a promise she made to Nathan, the man she had loved, the man who had trained her not just to shoot but to survive. Nathan's memory lived in every breath she took, every shot she fired, and she had made him proud. She didn't need validation from anyone else. She had done it for him, for herself, and for the promise of a future she was still learning to navigate. Blake, still clutching the target, turned to the crowd with a forced smile. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, trying to salvage some semblance of control. But his voice lacked conviction, and the words fell flat. He knew he was defeated, and deep down, so did the crowd. The energy in the room had shifted. What started as a spectacle, a display of wealth and privilege, had turned into a moment of quiet revolution. Rebecca Johnson, who had watched everything unfold with increasing admiration, stepped forward. Her professional demeanor slipped slightly, replaced with a flicker of respect. "That wasn't luck, Mr. Radcliffe," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "That was skill, and it's time you recognized it." Blake didn't answer. He stood there for a moment, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. But as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, he finally let out a defeated sigh, his shoulders slumping. His eyes turned back to Emma, and for the first time that day, there was no smug superiority in his gaze. Instead, it was something more, akin to grudging respect, a silent acknowledgement that Emma had proven something far more powerful than just her marksmanship. She had proven the value of perseverance, of humility, and of honor in a world where those qualities were often overshadowed by money and power. "I'll pay the bet," Blake said quietly, his voice tinged with defeat. He pulled out his checkbook, but Emma held up her hand, stopping him. "No," she said firmly. "The money goes to the Veteran Support Foundation, as we agreed. And I'm not here for your money, Blake." Blake nodded, his pride still wounded, but his sense of rightness now slowly returning. He signed the check, and the crowd cheered again, this time for the victory that Emma had achieved, not just in shooting, but in standing up for something larger than herself. The cameras were rolling, the press was buzzing, and in that moment, Emma became a symbol of something bigger than the competition. She was a symbol of resilience, of never backing down, no matter the odds. The crowd that had once laughed at her now stood in awe of her. But for Emma, the victory wasn't in the money or the fame. It wasn't even in the applause. It was in knowing that Nathan's legacy, his lessons, and his love had guided her to this moment. She had kept her promise to him, and in doing so, she had reclaimed a part of herself she had lost when he died. For the first time in years, Emma felt whole again. Not because of the challenge she had won, but because she had found the courage to step into a world that had once tried to break her and emerge victorious. As the competition ended, the world outside the club continued on, but for Emma it was the start of something new. The Foundation's mission was just beginning, and she was ready to take on the next challenge. She wasn't just the widow of a fallen hero anymore. She was a leader, a mentor, someone who had earned her place in the world, not through wealth or status, but through quiet strength and unwavering dedication. Emma took one last look around the room. Blake Radcliffe, once the untouchable champion, was already retreating into the shadows, but Emma, with nothing left to prove, stood tall and resolute, ready to begin the next chapter of her life, a chapter where she would no longer be invisible, but essential. And as she stepped out of the elite shooters club, the world outside waiting for her, Emma smiled softly to herself. She had done it, and in doing so, she had shown everyone, especially herself, that sometimes the quietest voices have the most powerful stories to tell. Her story wasn't over. It had only just begun.